Hello, my name's Toby Thompson. I'm here today with Dina, Andrey Pavlov and Pietro Micheli. We're talking about performance. These guys know a thing or two about performance, and we're looking at this book, which is just out from Wiley, Measurement Madness. I'm keen to find out a bit more about that one. Dina, can I ask you first, why this book and why now?
Well, the book comes from a huge background that we have. Although we're three academics, we've probably between us, we've got 30 to 45 years of experience of working with organisations. And actually what we've been finding in working with those organisations is the same stories are coming through, the same problems are coming through when organisations are using measurement to improve their performance. But it's those background dysfunctional problems that occur through using measurement. And we collated all of those stories and we thought what a great opportunity to share those stories, but also to share the learning and to help organisations improve their use of performance measurement.
So there's loads of stories in the books. You must have a favourite, Pietro. Which one are you picking up on, which illustrates a lot of this madness?
Yeah, so yes, we have stories from all sorts of sectors. One that we particularly like is the one about train times. So of course, as a passenger, the one thing that you want is to arrive on time. And so arrival on time is a key measure that lots of train companies have around the world. Now, of course, this can be calculated in different ways, but usually is within 5 minutes from the time that is in the timetable. And so a train is delayed if it's 10 minutes late, 2 hours late. And of course, that generates all sorts of strange behaviors. For example, we've seen train drivers that have skipped stops to get to destination on time. Or equally, if a train is delayed by half an hour, then it can be delayed by 3 hours. And so the scheduling of the train companies changed dramatically, and you've got trains waiting in the countryside for long. Or we've had examples where the train drivers were paid to some extent rightly for doing overtime, but that incentivized them to arrive late to destination because then they could get the incentive. As you can see, measurement in a relatively simple context can create all sorts of problems and lead to the madness that we discuss in the book.
That's amazing to hear. I can't quite believe that story. What do you think?
I think what it illustrates is this idea that measures are actually never measures. And when the train companies, for instance, put those measures in place, they did not expect these behaviors to spring up. They actually wanted something else. They wanted to see how the trains were operating. They wanted to see whether their processes were efficient. But actually what they got on the back of it is all sorts of dysfunctional behaviors. And I think this is a really big part of the book and a really big theme. And I think this is what very often people don't realize when they put performance measures in place.
So they seem to be foiling themselves. They seem to be setting themselves a target for a certain aim, but failing to reach it and then tripping themselves up.
Absolutely. And it's about setting the right target that companies think about how that behaviour is going to be engendered. And many companies will set a target hoping for a particular behaviour, but actually they end up rewarding a completely different behaviour. And actually reward is incredible, because as soon as you start to put rewards onto measures, it just amplifies that behaviour. So quite rightly, as Pietro just said, that if you pay somebody overtime because they're working longer, that amplifies that whole behaviour as, well, if I slow the train down and I arrive 10 minutes later, I'll get my overtime. So you have to be very, very careful that you're not creating madness by paying people to behave in a particular way.
So why do measurements like this lead to madness? It doesn't seem to make sense.
Well, I think what happens is what measures actually do is they tempt us with an illusion of control. So it's almost the idea that if we put the measures in place, we can control the company, we can control the processes, we can control the people. And measures seem to be this sort of this thing that leads us to this illusion.
So your book must talk about why we do this. Why do we keep on doing it?
Because it is the illusion of control and the illusion of knowledge. We think that just by measuring something, we're going to know perfectly about it. And also that something is just not going to change. Or is it just going to change the way we think? But unfortunately, as the book says, the consequences of measurements are very many. And very often they can be dysfunctional if we don't understand them in advance. So the idea that measurement does not affect people is absolutely false. The idea is that instead it does influence people, and if we start with that thought, that can be much more productive, because we can try to understand how we want to influence the actions and the behaviors of people, as opposed to trying to control whatever is around us in our organization.
Surely, big data is upon us. We surely have all the data we possibly want. We're going to get better and better at this, aren't we?
No, I would say we're going to get worse and worse at this, just because big data is around doesn't mean to say we're getting better. We're getting better at collecting data. We can collect data on all sorts of aspects that are going on in the world. But then using that data to make informed decisions, to think about the way in which an organisation needs to perform, is almost, big data leads to bigger madness. So it's about how do we use this data sensibly to overcome some of the problems that we've been illustrating.
Sounds quite a negative view. There must be some hope somewhere in this book. Pietro.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the book really tries to illustrate the madness, and then at the end of every chapter we try to explain how to address those problems and actually how to use performance measurement systems in a productive way, because we can. That's the important thing. So we have to remind ourselves that performance measurement systems can be a force for good, if you like, but very often we underestimate the consequences, and we kind of think, that everything is going to be fine as long as we get good data. As you said, big data is very important, but technology is not going to take the behavioral consequences away. In fact, it might just grow simply because we get access to more of it. And try to understand those behavioral patterns is really key. And that's what we try to illustrate and show the positive side of things and how we can overcome the negatives.
So how does this relate to organizations in terms of performance?
This is a good question, because this is very much around how does an organization perform when it's come up with its strategy and it wants to implement that strategy and it wants to align all of the people in the organization to the goal that the organization is trying to perform. What happens is that these organizations put in strategic performance measurement systems and strategic performance measurement frameworks, and therefore expand this down through an organization. So the measures aren't just on individuals, the measures are about how the whole organization is performing.
I think it's a really good point that Dina is bringing up, because in a way this is how performance measurement is seen in organizations. And on one hand, this is the source of the big power of performance measurement, but this is also one of the biggest dangers of it, because the illusion is that we can introduce a set of performance indicators. It will be balanced, it will be correct. We'll think about how we do it, and if we just get it right, the strategy will be implemented. We can retire to the beach, we can relax, and everything will roll along nicely. But this, of course, is an illusion for some of the reasons that we've talked about already, some of the behaviors that measures engender, and also just because the situation keeps changing. And if the situation keeps changing, the measures need to be revised and the system needs to be rethought. So actually, trusting in measures too much is a really big danger.
So, Pietro, are we looking at a recipe for performance measurement?
There is no recipe, and that's what the book argues. You've got lots of choices that depend on your context. So you can implement a very diffuse measurement system with lots of measures. You can use targets and incentives. You can decide to have a very slim measurement system. You can revise it very often. You can do lots of different things, but it's very context dependent. It really depends on what you want it to do and where you're at. And that's a key point in the book. There is no recipe, I'm afraid, but there are better ways and there are worse ways.
Okay.
I think it's a really good point that Pietro is bringing up, because I think what we mean in general is we need to understand what we are using the measures for. And if we want a relatively nimble performance measurement system, we have to keep it as such. If we want performance measures to influence behaviors, we have to understand that this is what we are doing, and therefore we need to observe how the behaviors are changing. If we put in performance measures for relatively objective processes, we need to understand how we need to collect data on the basis of it. But the point is that we need to understand why we are doing it before we put it in. So we don't treat it as a cure-all, we treat it as a tool.
Sounds like a really useful mirror that you're holding up to everybody to say this is what you're doing. Guys, thank you very much indeed for your time today, and thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.